Good morning. Thank you all for turning out early on a Saturday. Source of hope and inspiration to be able to do that. We got a lot of ground to cover. My interest in the national security aspect of climate change happened about 2003, reading through the military's quadrennial report that said climate change was a greater threat to national security than terrorism. And I was surprised to read it, and I'll just highlight some of that report and some of the subsequent reports. I went with the League of Conservation Voters to Washington to lobby to try to pass a renewable energy bill, and we had presentations from generals, admirals, big business, in order to talk about the need for climate change policies in the United States pushing toward renewables. And for our Earth Days, we have been bringing in scientists from the military to talk about energy conservation because they've actually taken the lead. They see the importance of this. To underscore in a political sense what Jim was talking about with climate change, the UN has undertaken 6 massive studies to look at climate change, including 2,000 scientists from 100 countries. So these are comprehensive studies from a range of disciplines. And the UN has concluded, as has the CIA, the Defense Intelligence Agency, the Department of Energy, the Department of Homeland Security, and the Government Accountability Office, that there is a need to support the President's Climate Change Action Program. All of these studies predict more floods, famines, fires, blizzards, mass migration, the spread of disease, resource wars, and competition over the Arctic Ocean as the ice melts. These changes were referred to as threat multipliers by the military until 2014, when they were called catalysts for conflict, which will weaken fragile governments and create political space for militant groups. Global citizenship is thrust upon us, and our fates are tied as never before. We're closer to Japan now in terms of trade, finance, transportation, and communication than South Carolina was to New York when the Constitution was signed. Our oceans have shrunk to lakes. Our civilization is a force of nature, and it's threatening our security. If our Earth was the size of an apple, the atmosphere would be the thickness of the skin, and we're filling our atmosphere with more greenhouse gases than the Earth has seen for 650,000 years. Our hydrologic cycle has changed due to the increase in temperature, and at this point we're about 1 degree higher than we had been 100 years ago. This causes more evaporation, and there's about 5% more moisture in the atmosphere. This leads to a changing of weather patterns, but also to greater storms, blizzards, and deeper droughts. Water security is linked to food security, and about 3 billion people are living on about $3 a day. As always, the poor are the most vulnerable. 4 years of drought in northern Syria from 2006 to 2010 contributed significantly to that civil war. Yemen's capital city of Sana'a is expected to run out of water soon. Yemen is deeply involved in a civil war. The country of Jordan hosted a conference 2 years ago on suppressing the use of water as a tool of war. Secretary of State John Kerry stated last year, "Tribes are killing each other over water today. Think of what happens if you have massive dislocations or the drying up of the waters of the Nile or the rivers of India." In northern Africa, we see the Sahara Desert steadily expanding south. A contributing factor in the rise of Al-Qaeda in northern Mali and Boko Haram in Nigeria. The flood of 2010 in Pakistan covered almost 1/6 of the country. 7 million people were refugees. The government was overwhelmed, and the Taliban and other militant groups stepped into the breach to provide relief. A country with 50 nuclear weapons. Here in South Carolina, we experienced the tragedies associated with flooding. The UN reports that weather-related disasters are becoming more frequent due to the rise in floods and storms. From 1995 to 2015, flooding affected more than 2 billion people, with the greatest impact on low-income countries. Rising sea levels are putting people and food supplies in vulnerable coastal regions like eastern India, Bangladesh, Shanghai, Mekong Delta in Vietnam at risk. Miami is flooded now on a regular basis, as are many coastal cities around the world. This will lead to a massive new wave of refugees. Insect vectors like the Zika virus have changed, and imagine the implications. Global warming impacts the poles more than the equator. The albedo effect causes polar ice to reflect heat, but once it melts, the dark ocean absorbs the heat, feedback loop. In 2007, scientists were shocked that more than 1/3 of the Arctic ice sheet had melted, an area the size east of our Mississippi River. This opened the possibility of a Northwest Passage from Asia to North America and opportunities to mine minerals and drill large deposits of oil and gas. Some analysts highlight the Russian planting of their flag under the North Pole and the firing of intermediate-range ballistic missiles as a sign of upcoming conflicts over resources. Others argue that the UN Law of the Seas, Section 76, and collaborative forums like the Arctic Council can set legal frameworks. But due to the pressure from oil companies, our country has not ratified the UN Law of the Seas. These statutes assert a 200-mile legal limit, but remain unclear regarding disputed islands. By 2025, transpolar shipping routes will be common. Admiral Titley has stated, quote, "It's inevitable that the Navy will have to respond to oil rig disasters, search and rescue missions, for which the Navy is not prepared." Admiral Samuel Locklear, in charge of the Armed Forces of the Pacific, argues, quote, "The political and social upheaval we're likely to see from climate change will cripple the security environment." Although he was asked to clarify his remarks by the Armed Services Committee, he was actually cut off by Senator Inhofe, who has consistently denied that climate change exists. In the past election cycle, the wealthiest 1% has donated 98% of the money. Oil and gas interests are leading contributors. The Koch brothers, oil and gas barons, put more money into elections than the Republican Party. The top 5 oil companies make about $375 million a day. This has contributed significantly to 49 senators denying the role of our civilization in causing climate change. 3 numbers to keep in mind. 2 degrees, at which point the scientists agree that the weather patterns change so markedly that we will not be able to predict them at all. And this was discussed at the Copenhagen Conference of the UN. Then think in terms of gigatons, 575 gigatons. That's the amount of carbon dioxide, if it comes into the air, will cause the temperature to rise more than 2 degrees. But proven oil and gas reserves are at 5 times that amount. So the money that the oil and gas companies have invested in, if they are to use all of that, the increase in climate would be 8 to 10 degrees. We're still addicted to fossil fuels, which leaves us dependent on unreliable trade partners like Saudi Arabia and spending a fortune guarding sea lanes. Clearly, borrowing billions from China to buy oil from the Middle East is not wise, but drilling more domestically has a similar effect on the environment. Hydraulic fracturing, fracking, seems like a partial answer, but it releases methane, which is 20 times more potent as a greenhouse gas than CO2. And drilling offshore, we've seen with the BP oil spill, the nature of the risks. So we're called to think globally and act locally to protect future generations. All great faiths have talked about the need for harmony with the earth. Yes, in the Old Testament is be not complacent in Zion. Professor Foster reminded us of being stewards of the earth from the New Testament, and Native Americans revere Mother Earth and speak of the need to take each action mindful of its impact for 7 generations. Climate change creates an unprecedented opportunity to finally confront some of the causes of suffering. We'll look at some of the options for renewable energy and conservation today, and they're bringing the world together in different fashions than we've seen before through UN conferences. Seen from space, our planet is a Garden of Eden. In our time, without realizing it, we attain the knowledge and power to radically transform it. We've bitten the apple of knowledge. Our choices are awesome and eternal, choices to be mourned or celebrated by future generations. Thank you.